In this lecture, we are going to toggle the visibility of the modal. As we learned, the modal is hidden by setting the Display CSS property to none. Displaying the modal is as simple as updating the display property to block. Before toggling this property, we must decide when this property should be updated. In the header, we have a login link. Let's inspect this element with the developer tools. I haven't mentioned this, but I added a class called OpenModal to the link. We are going to add an event listener to elements with the OpenModal class. Notice how I said elements. We are going to allow multiple elements to open the modal, as long as an element has the OpenModal class. Clicking on the element should cause the modal to appear. This means we can tell our clients to add this class to any element that should cause the modal to open. For starters, we will update the login link from the header tools block to cause the modal to open. Let's get started. We are going to be working inside the frontend.js file. The first step is to listen for events on elements with the OpenModal class. Inside the function, we are going to remove the console statement. In its place, create a variable called OpenModal button. The value for this variable will be the document.querySelectAll function with the OpenModal class. Keep in mind, we're going to allow this class to be added to multiple elements. Therefore, we should select all elements with this class. Unlike the document object, we can't immediately apply the add event listener to our variable. The variable will store an array of elements. Unfortunately, the browser does not allow us to listen for events on arrays. We must individually add an event listener to each element. There's just one problem. We don't know how many elements have been found with this class. The best approach is to loop through the array. Below the variable, chain a function called forEach to the OpenModal button variable. JavaScript has various functions for looping through an array. If a variable is an array, we have access to these functions. One of the functions is called forEach. It's the simplest function available for looping through an array. This function will iterate through each item in the array. This syntax might feel strange. It's as if we're treating the variable as an object. That's one of the cool behaviors of JavaScript. We can treat a regular value as if it were an object. JavaScript will supply us with methods and properties for interacting with the value. Back to the task at hand, we can pass in a function to handle each iteration. Let's pass in an arrow function. This function will be provided the item from the current iteration as an argument. Let's call the argument element. Since we have an array of elements, this argument will reference the element. We can hover our mouse over this argument for confirmation. According to Visual Studio Code, the argument will hold an element. At this point, it's safe to chain the addEventListener function. Let's go ahead with chaining this function on the element argument. We are going to use a simple event called click. As you can guess, this event is emitted when the element has been clicked on. Next, let's pass in a function for handling the event. This function will be provided the event object. The event object contains information on the event, such as the element that caused the event. Clients may be tempted to apply the OpenModal class to an anchor element. Anchor elements will cause the browser to refresh the page, which isn't what we want. The event object contains a function for preventing the default behavior called preventDefault. Let's call this function. By calling this function, we can avoid page refreshes. We're getting close to opening the modal. The final step is to open the modal by toggling the display property. I've added a class to help us change the display property. However, we don't have access to the modal element. Let's create a variable for referencing the modal. We're not going to create this variable directly in the event. Be mindful of the fact that we're going to close the modal. To close the modal, we're going to need a reference to the modal. It would make sense to create this variable outside of the event. Below the Open Modal button variable, define a variable called modal element. The value for this variable will be the query selector function. The selector for the element will be the following: WP block Udemy plus off modal. The modal will be selected by the class generated for blocks. We're going to assume there will be one modal. If there are multiple modals, this query will select the first modal it finds. By storing the modal, we can begin to toggle classes. Back inside the event handler, let's run the following function: modal element.class list.add. Every element will have an object called class list. This object will contain a list of classes applied to the element. We can add a new class by calling the add function. This function accepts the class name as a string. Let's add a class called modal show. This class can be found in our block CSS. It'll change the display property to block. You can check the CSS to view this class's styles. Let's refresh the experimental page in the browser. If we did everything right, we should be able to click on the login link from the page. Don't click on the link from the header. This is the static version. It may or may not work. After clicking the link, the modal will appear. Toggling the modal took a lot of work. First, we had to search for elements with the Open Modal class. Afterward, we had to loop through every element to listen for a click event. Lastly, we opened the modal by adding a class that modifies the display property. We're able to open the modal, but we can't close it. That's going to be the next task. Before we start writing code, let's talk about when to close the modal. The modal should be closed if the exit button is clicked on. Alternatively, clicking on the opaque overlay should close the modal too. We have two elements responsible for closing the modal. Let's get started. Switch back to the text editor. The first step is to select these elements. However, there's just one problem. To make things slightly difficult, I've given both elements different classes. Therefore, we need to select both elements with different queries. Luckily, JavaScript supports multiple selectors with the query selector all function. Below the modal element variable, create a variable called modal close element. Next, set the variable's value to the document.querySelectorAll function. Since multiple elements can close the modal, we must use the querySelectorAll function. Inside this function, pass in the following selectors: modal overlay, modal button close. We can add multiple selectors by separating them with a comma. It's similar to CSS. It's not necessary to create two variables to select multiple elements. We can continue to use a single variable. Moving on, let's begin looping through these elements. Below the first loop, call the forEach function on the modal close element variable. Next, pass in a function to handle each iteration. Let's refer to the current element as element. The function is going to be very similar to the first function. To save time, let's copy the code from the first loop into the second loop. To remove the modal from the page, we must reverse the changes applied to the modal. From the first loop, we added the modal show class. Therefore, we must remove it. We can remove a class by replacing the add function with the remove function. As the name implies, this function will remove a class from an element. Let's try testing our code. Refresh the page. The modal should continue to open. Before closing the modal, let's click around the modal's content area. None of our clicks should cause the modal to close. Clicking on the close button should cause it to close. The same goes for clicking on the overlay. Perfect! We've successfully opened and closed the modal. The most challenging part of this process was selecting multiple elements with the same class or different sets of classes. Either way, we had to loop through the elements to apply an event listener. This step is very important. We can't apply event listeners to an entire array. In the next lecture, let's start working on the tabs.